welcome to The Next Big Thing. Joining me today is investigative journalist Florence de Changy, who has worked for Le Monde and French radio. And you've been covering the Asia-Pacific region for over, 25 years or so? Today, today you're here to talk about the famous Malaysian Airlines Flight 370 that went missing in March of 2014. And you're also here to talk about your book as well that details the investigation and your research in your new book called The Disappearing Act. So, Florence, thank you so much for joining me today.
You're very welcome.
Okay, so, as I've mentioned in the introduction, it's been 7 years almost since, Malaysian Airlines Flight 370 disappeared, as was reported. Now, for someone who has been researching this extensively and writing about it extensively, reporting, where do we currently stand with the situation right now, 7 years later?
Yeah, it's more than 7 years, actually. And we stand, depending where you are, I think on the official investigation side, they have published their final report. So the technical investigation that had to take place, that always has to take place by law after the loss of a plane, is finished. The report was published in July 2018. And as far as they are concerned, they finished their job and they will not reconsider. In terms of actual search of the plane and of the hull, it's also theoretically finished, but the Malaysian authorities have said, probably to be kind and considerate to the families, that should some new significant clue come up, they would possibly start the search again. But in theory, everything is pretty much finished, except, I would say, for the French investigation, because there was an investigation, a formal investigation, because of the 4 French citizens who were on board, and the French investigation is not finished yet. It's ongoing, and I don't know what's happening there, but that's still going.
Mm. And, despite the many reports that say, the flight disappeared or it vanished, you believe that it couldn't just have vanished. We use this term disappeared and vanished, and you believe that, it simply couldn't happen.
No, for sure.
And, yep.
Yeah, I think it's very important to state, and I think most people would agree, that in 2014, a B777, which is, one of the safest, if not the safest plane available, does not disappear, let alone in one of the most monitored region of the world, which is either the South China Sea, if you take into account the actual last point of contact, which was between Malaysia and Vietnam, or in the Malacca Straits, if you take into account what they said was the last radar echo. But both these regions are constantly monitored by all kinds of means, satellites, radars, and a plane in itself is meant to be seen by many different systems. So claiming that we have lost a B777 in this day and age, when supposedly we can see an apple on the moon and we can be live with the planet Mars, is just not acceptable. It's an insult to human intelligence. And I really said, once I started digging into that story, people, including the media, including the mainstream media that I'm part of, we should stop repeating that this story is incredible. It's not incredible. It is simply not credible. The problem with the story is what we keep on repeating about it, that we've lost the trace of such a plane, and that the 239 bodies who were on board are unaccounted for and simply missing. So that was very much kind of the base ground from which I started, saying there is something deeply wrong with that narrative. And then I looked at it, step by step.
And so, with this book, you took it in a different direction. I feel like, with everything that's been reported in the media, you chose to sort of have all this evidence in one book, and then what you decided to do is leave it up to the readers, let them sort of decide how they can, what they can make of this investigation. What did you believe that was one of the ways to go about this?
Well, number one, because I still don't have 100% of the story. I still, some readers are more convinced than myself by the validity of all the clues I bring. But I really want to be contradicted in all the evidence that I put forward, because most of what I research and describe in the book are facts that can be checked. Right. I quote most of the sources. Of course, in some cases, actually the people who I can't quote are more people who explain to me how to understand this or that. But really, you can double check, I would say probably 90% of what is in the book. And surprisingly, a lot of my information is actually from the official report. Sorry, I lost the train of my thought.
Yep, no, that's okay. So, other than the inconsistencies that you sort of point out and that you talked about, what do you think surprised you the most with this investigation?
Well, in the process of the investigation itself, there were so many moments where I really thought, oh, wow, how can this be possible? But sometimes in some cases, I just remember the feeling and the impression and the moment, and I don't even remember to what it was related. Because honestly, I think there must have been at least 10 or 15 of these moments. Very far back in time, a small thing was when I realized that Malaysia Airline actually had, I forgot, it's in the book, but something like 17 B777 of exactly the same type than MH370. And, everyone believes, and it's something that is often said that every plane is very carefully followed and traced, etc. And I realized that in the case of Malaysia Airline, they had purchased these 17 B777s in the late 90s and early 2000, and only 6 of these planes were still flying. By comparison, Air France, the French airline, had also purchased 14 of very similar B777-200ER planes at the same period, late 90s, early 2000. And their 14 planes were still flying. So it was a shock. I thought, wow, how can a company afford such wastage on planes? But of course, so that was just one little epiphany. And then I went through all these planes and tried to find what have they become, etc. That's when I was trying to trace if the flaperon that was found in Reunion could have come from a different place. But then more recently, more towards the end of the latest edition of my book, when I double-checked and went through the official report again, checking the cargo, because there was clearly something to do with that plane, and someone had told me, it's probably the solution to your enigma is in the plane. And so I thought that I would read again the part about the cargo in the official report. And now I see something that I had already highlighted, but that did not jump at me, which was the fact that there is a massive cargo of 2.5 tons of electronic goods, which, number one, was very poorly described, but was actually not X-rayed, so loaded on board without being X-rayed. And I didn't realize how bad was that. And I called someone I know who is the head of cargo in one of the biggest airline that does cargo in the world. And he very clearly told me that's an absolute no. You do not load anything on a plane that has not been X-rayed. Now we have 2.5 tons of electronic goods, which are described as talkie-walkies and batteries, so cheap and small things, which have not been X-rayed for the reason that they were too bulky. So that's clearly a lie. So we have a big problem. That's a big red flag with that cargo. And then not only that, you realize, and it's also written in the official report only once, but it's written, that this same cargo that was loaded on the very night without being X-rayed has been escorted to the airport. From the place it was coming from, Penang, north, about 200 kilometers north of Kuala Lumpur, to the airport, it's been escorted. So there is no good reason for that. This is really a double red flags. And it was one of these moments.
And I feel like there's so many, red flags in this investigation, as you've mentioned. One of them being is, that you've pointed out is the pilot, for example, had, simply turned off this transponder system. That's one of the theories, that suggests that that the pilot had turned this system off, that sort of maybe, caused the plane to disappear off the radar. So I guess my question is now, what justification has been made for that theory of like why the pilot decided, if he did, why did he choose to kind of turn this thing off, that's simply not taught in flight schools and things like that?
Yeah. At the beginning, actually, I thought, when I wanted to just look a bit deeper in that story, I thought, let's deconstruct the official narrative. And as you say, at the very beginning, one of the first things we were told was that the pilot turned all the communication off. Two things were mentioned. Number one, the transponder, and number two, what is called the ACARS system. Actually, I looked at the way, again, in the official report, the way the transponder is supposed to have been turned off. What you see in it is that the plane disappeared from the screens of the traffic controllers. You can imagine you're a traffic controller, and normally you see the plane on your screen, many other planes, and each of them have got several indications going with them. Their direction, their altitude, their name, obviously, the call sign, stroke, etc. And what happens in the case of MH370? What happens normally when you turn the transponder off, as they said the pilot did or someone did, is that everything comes off in one go. In the case of MH370, it's very interesting because there is almost 40 seconds. So that's a very, very long time between two parts of the signal of the plane. Basically, it's called mode S and mode C. And no one can explain. That is the proof in itself that the transponder was not turned off, as it has been said. And then the other story, which was proposed and promoted very early on, to give the impression that the pilot was or the pilot or whoever was in charge of what happened, was such an incredible maestro of disappearing a plane, was that they turn off what is called the ACAR system. And in fact, when I started to look into it and say, how do we know that this ACAR system was turned off? Because the ACAR system, just to explain, is a system that will send automated, it means it's an automatic system that sends records of the plane. And depending on which subscription you kind of buy, you either send it every 10 minutes, every half hour, every hour. In the case of Malaysia Airlines, it was every half hour. So the message that was sent at 1:07 went, no problem. The plane emitted it and it was received. But the message at 1:37 was not sent and not received. So they've assumed that someone turned the ACARs off. What I found is actually they have absolutely no proof whatsoever. And this does not appear anywhere in the official report either. So the two key things at the beginning to pretend that there was willful interruption of the communication systems are either inconsistent with the proofs that we have or not proven. So that was the very beginning. And later, because you mentioned the pilot, I decided to look much closer into him, Captain Zahari Shah, because a lot had been said about him. And I wanted to have a clear idea about what kind of man he was, and was he capable of committing such a horrible act? And as you probably know, my conclusion was no.
And as you mentioned in the beginning as well, having this plane disappear or suggested to have disappeared in a place where it's there's 24-hour surveillance, whether that's oceanic surveillance, whether that's satellite surveillance. Does this suggest that the technology that we have in this 21st century, in this day and age, is not as reliable as we thought, especially when it comes to flights and sky navigation and sky surveillance?
No, I don't think so. I mean, all the pilots I talk to, they are adamant that a plane is built to be seen and to be heard. So, all the systems are redundant already. They will all tell you that. And that's why pretending that now we've got to improve the systems, it's irrelevant. And that's why also it's a completely different story that happened. It is true that in some cases, for example, when a plane is in the middle of the ocean, let's say, the big oceans like the Pacific, the Indian, the Atlantic, yes, there are some points where it's probably not connected to anyone anymore. But remember that the place where it's supposed to be disappeared is in a super busy way. We are at the heart of Asia, between Malaysia and Vietnam. So Thailand is there, Philippines is not far, China is at the north. And also, it's another point that I've made. If the idea was to disappear, it would have been much more sensible and logical to just go straight and go and crash your plane in the middle of the Pacific, which is an even larger and bigger and deeper ocean than this nonsensical, sophisticated U-turn and then ending in the Indian Ocean. So I don't think that there is any problem with the technology we have. On the contrary, I think that all the technology we have allowed us to know and to track this plane. But for some reason, we and the families are not told what truly happened to the plane.
Now, with the aftermath of the plane's disappearance, the Malaysian government played a huge role in providing whatever information was available to the families who, had questions, who had concerns. But, I feel like, you pointed out in your book as well that the Malaysian government didn't quite give that sense of comfort or even transparency for families. What could they have done for families even now what could they have done to be more transparent about the investigation?
What is very interesting is to see what has been said at the beginning during the first few hours, because usually when you have a cover-up or when you have a new narrative that comes into play to cover something or to replace the truth, it takes a bit of time to be conceived and to be fine-tuned, etc. So what's very interesting is that I think that at the beginning, Malaysia is sincere. They have no reason to lie, and they are really at a loss with what happened. So what they say very clearly, and this is during the first 6 press statement, is that they lost the plane at 2:40 a.m. That's very interesting and important to remember, because I know it's a bit of a detail. It sounds like a detail, but it's key, because in the official narrative later on, we were always told that the plane did its U-turn around 1:30. Basically, what happened is that, just to remind everyone, the last message saying good night MH370 from the cockpit towards the traffic controller in Kuala Lumpur was at 1:19. So that's the last voice recorded that we have. 2 minutes later, at 1:21, that's when the plane starts to disappear from the screens of the traffic controllers that were looking at it. And initially, during the first few hours, actually during the first 24 hours, Malaysia says that they lost the plane at 2:40. So that's only 1 hour and 10 minutes after it disappeared from the radar screens. What I call the official narrative, which is the story that has been told later on and which still is supposed to prevail nowadays, is that the plane actually continued to fly, did its U-turn, went up into the Malacca Straits, went around Indonesia, and then for no reason whatsoever decided to go down south towards Antarctica, basically, and crashed there once it just ran out of fuel. So initially, Malaysia did not lie, I think. They said it as they knew it. And what I also find quite extraordinary is that if you look at the transcript of the conversation that took place between the actors on that night, who were following the plane and trying to track it, you discover a lot of fascinating truth, in a way, which for some reason has not been redacted from the official report, but which portray a completely different story of what happened to the plane. And this is there to be seen. It's written black on white in the appendix of the official report. And what you see then, if I can be a bit specific, on that night, basically when a plane flies, if it's a Malaysian airline flight, it is always followed by what is called the operation centers of Malaysia Airlines. If you are on United Airlines or Air Canada, you will be followed by the company's operation center. So you always have kind of your mother company who stays in contact with you. And then, of course, according to the flying region that you are crossing, you are also in contact and controlled by the traffic controller that you are visiting in a way. So what's happening in the case of Malaysia Airline 370, MH370, is that at the moment it disappears, it is covered, one, by the company, Malaysia Airline Operations Center, two, by the traffic controller of Malaysia, which is the KLCC ATC, Air Traffic Controller, and it is expected by the Vietnamese traffic controller. And these three people are kind of talking together during that night. Actually, Malaysia Operations Center only talks to the Malaysian traffic controller. And at one point, you have the Operations Center informing the traffic controller that they have reconnected with the plane. They say we are downloading its position, and this is north of Vietnam, and this is at 2:28. And a few minutes later, you have the traffic controller in Vietnam, which is suddenly saying to its counterpart in Kuala Lumpur, the plane is landing. And this is written on the transcript. So no one can make up things like that, especially, and all the more, I would say, when they are in blatant contradiction with the official narrative. And I am really amazed to see that there is so many clues out there. You know, it's like we say, hidden in plain sight. It is written. Actually, I've got the papers nearby here. I was looking at them again recently. It's unbelievable. It is written, the plane is landing. A few minutes before, the operations center is repeating to the traffic controller in Kuala Lumpur the position of the plane that they have just downloaded. And this is north of Vietnam. And I know for people who don't have the map in mind, it's a bit complicated. But basically, if the plane continued to go northeast towards Beijing, then it's very logical that it was in northeast of Vietnam at this moment. The official narrative, what we have been told, is that 1 hour before, the plane did a U-turn and was already in a completely different place of the globe. Right. So, there are all these incredible clues which are available to be just looked at. And that's what I do in my book.
And so, you know, in your book as well, you talk about, you know, your visit to the Maldives and what that, you know, the clues that were discovered there, because there were sightings or, you know, interviews that you had done where people, you know, said that there was a low plane and there were, you know, these loud sounds of a potential plane. How did, you know, during that time, what sort of, how did that sort of propel you to further investigate and to gather more evidence of whether this plane actually flew over those islands or that island?
Yeah, well, at the beginning, I was just trying to check all the different narratives that were created around the disappearance of that plane. And, you know, I would look at each of them and see if they were valid or not. I did it for the cargo, the mangosteen originally, etc. And already 1 year after the plane had disappeared, the story of the Maldives was still around. So I still had some doubt. And I was like, well, I need to clear this up, because either these people have really seen MH370 flying low on the morning of Saturday, the 8th of March, in which case there is no way the plane crashed west of Australia, because it's in the Indian Ocean, but it's like 4,000 or 5,000 kilometers away. Or they have not seen that plane, and we need to close that door and stop mentioning it, because, you know, it creates a very muddled and confusing context to the story. And sometimes I was under the impression that some people, for some reason, would like to keep all these options open so that people can just decide what story they like best, you know. Oh, no, I think it's in the Maldives, or I think it was shot down by Diego Garcia. And let's not clear anything. But I decided that the only way to progress in the investigation was actually to do the opposite. Like, take one story, look at it. Is it valid? Should I keep it as possible, maybe? Or should I just dump it? And in the case of the Maldives, I was lucky enough that my newspaper, Le Monde, agreed to send me there to find out. And it was a very interesting investigation. And surprisingly, it was very straightforward. Because two things I understood. I mean, it was not straightforward to get there because it's a very remote little place.
Right.
And the village where the villagers said they saw a very big plane flying low. First observation, if a B777 flies low over any city, even New York, you would have many people noticing. So if a B777, I mean, it's massive. It's almost the size of 2 Olympic swimming pools, like 63 meters in length and 61 in width. So it's just massive. And if that B777 had indeed flown low above this little village, it's not 5 or 10 people who would have noticed it. Everyone would have been out and would have been shaken out of their little houses, number one. But more important than that, the time. It was very easy to establish the time because people there, it was Saturday, and so they go to mosque at 6 or 7 in the morning, so that's a very precise time. And the women, they go to their own prayer, and the children, they go to their school, religious school, on the Saturday. So everyone knows exactly at what time it is that they saw that plane. And so you calculate, there is 3 hours difference. So at the time they saw the plane was supposed to have landed in Beijing 3 hours before. And maximum they could have 1.5 to 2 hours of extra fuel. But it's simply not possible that MH370 was still flying at that time. As simple as that. So, of course, you could imagine that it landed somewhere, took some more fuel, but it becomes a super sophisticated scenario. And then the second thing, because the time is wrong, so you don't even need a further proof that it's not MH370 because it just hasn't got enough fuel to be flying at that time. But I also asked the people, where did you see the plane coming from? And it's very easy because they are in their little compound or in their backyard, and everyone has got some objects or things they can refer to. Like, for example, it's between this tree and my wall or something. And then you put you take your phone, your iPhone on which you have your compass, and you look at the direction, and you see that the plane was coming from the west or the northwest. And I was telling these people, well, do you realize Malaysia is that side? And you're telling me the plane is coming from this side. So it should have done a massive turn to arrive from basically the opposite direction. And so there were quite a few things. And then I tried to think, I knew these people were sincere. So I tried to find a decent explanation for what they may have seen. And it's actually one of the person that I interviewed who gave me what I think was the good explanation, which was the fact that a new runway had just been built and there was wind on that night, not on that night, on that day. And it's very possible that a plane mistook one atoll for the next because from the sky, they have the same shape. And also something that people forget is that on this small island, you don't have a control tower. So you're really flying your small plane according to your instrument. And it was just flying much lower than normal because it was preparing to land. And it surprised many people. And then later, when I went back into the big town of Maldives, I found that the cover of these planes is actually red and blue and white. So some of the description was consistent to some extent. And I also checked the timing of the planes landing in Timarafushi, the next atoll, and there was one which was consistent. So I'm not 100% sure because I didn't I could not find the pilot who actually confessed and said, you are right. It was me. I was distracted. It was the first time I flew on this new runway. And because there was unusual wind, I actually I first approached the wrong atoll. That would be the ultimate proof. But what I know for sure, and it was enough for my investigation, was that it was certainly not MH370 that they saw. And by the way, I remember, I'm sorry, when I lost my train of thought before, I remember, I think your question, I don't know if you want me to go back to it. I think you were asking me about the attitude of trusting the reader.
Oh, yes. Like leaving it up to the reader and yep.
Yeah, do you want me to address this a little bit?
Sure, yeah, you can go ahead.
Yeah. No, I think it's very important to trust the reader and to just share with him or her all my clues without trying to push too much in my own scenario, because it's more important for people to understand the actual facts that we have related to that story, what we know for sure, what we clearly don't know, and I put it to them. I try to establish it and say, what would you do with that? And of course, this plus this pushes me towards that kind of thinking. Then I check with some people who know, and they say, yes, this is realistic, or no, it would not happen that way. And I think I much prefer to engage the reader and his intelligence to kind of go along the investigation with me, because I don't want to dictate a new scenario that I'm not sure of. Most of my job in the book is to deconstruct and to establish and prove that the narrative that we have been forced upon, that we have been force-fed, is wrong. That is clear. But as far as establishing for sure what may have happened, I really want the reader to use their own common sense, and either they follow me or not. But I keep asking people, if you have a strong argument to contradict my demonstration, please share with me your arguments, your knowledge, and that's how we can progress.
So, I watched another interview of you, and one of the things that you had said was that the media had not done a good job in covering this story. Everybody that was, from CNN to like international media, they hadn't done a good job in covering this. So I guess my question is, why do you say that, and how could they have covered this in a better way, to say the least?
Well, the blame I put on the media, I also put on myself, because I was a part of the media who covered it when it first happened. And in this kind of crisis, we just follow what we are fed day after day. It was news like 24/7 on CNN for weeks, if not months. I think it's really been one of their best, their hit as far as coverage and audience is concerned. So to I think CNN is a very interesting case, actually. I think they treated the story as a fantastic, entertaining story. And they played too much on the incredible aspect of it, on the great mystery, instead of questioning. And as I said before, all of us, should not say that that story is incredible. We should say from the beginning that it is not credible. But when it's just the beginning, we depend on the information that we are fed, basically, because you have press conferences, you have ministers, you have militaries. They show you, or they promise that they will show you documents. It's very difficult during the first few days to just do your own investigation at the same time on something as complicated as a plane that has disappeared, because it's beyond us. And what happened after that is that people abandoned the story. And we are the way the media work at the moment, in this period, in this age, is that we move very quickly from one story to the next. And it takes a lot of time to actually pursue a story until you get a decent answer. And in my case, it's been more than 7 years now that the plane is lost and that we don't know, and that I continued to investigate. But most newspapers, most media cannot afford to put any journalist on a story for such a long time.
Well, I didn't know that. So, going back to the investigation.
I don't see you. Is that normal?
Sorry?
I don't see you, but is it okay? Oh, yeah.
Oh, I don't know what happened. Can you see me?
No problem. Yeah, now I see you.
Okay. Just let me know. Just let me know if anything goes wrong or anything.
Okay,
so, going back to the investigation, one of the things that I found interesting was that, when Australia took over, for example, a lot of people, I guess, maybe the United States or, international media, maybe, they started to have confidence in the investigation when Australia took over. But what I found interesting was that you didn't. You said that they didn't contribute to the investigation.
No.
They didn't need to. And frankly, it didn't make a difference with the investigation. So if you can elaborate on why you think Australia didn't do what they were supposed to do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Actually, people who are familiar with this kind of search, in case, subsea search, they were really baffled that Australia would be in charge, because Australia had no experience whatsoever in that kind of operation. They had only 4 passengers on board, and therefore Malaysia should really have appointed either one of them, or China could have taken charge, or they could have, appointed a country or just a team who would be really well known for doing this kind of job. On the contrary, Australia had and especially their ATSB, their Transport Safety Bureau, had a pretty poor record at that moment. They had just been blamed very badly for a terrible investigation they did into a previous crash, and actually Canada was asked to intervene, and there was a Senate commission, etc. So the ATSB needed to basically improve its reputation, and they just thought that this would be a fantastic opportunity for them to shine. They also brought a lot of diversion to the story, because suddenly the attention was not in the region in Asia where the plane had actually disappeared, but it moved thousands of kilometers south of the crime scene, if I can say. And suddenly all the media who were still following the story went down south. But my conclusion in the book about Australia's involvement in the story is, I'm saying, if Australia's job was to find the plane because they genuinely thought that it had crashed away from them, 2,000 kilometers west of their coast, well, of course, they failed. They failed very badly because despite what they call the greatest operation, etc., they haven't found a shred of evidence, nothing on the surface and nothing at the bottom of the sea. So if you consider that their mission was to find the plane, they failed. Now, if you think, as I think, in the end of my investigation and looking at my final scenario, if you think that their job is actually to provide a big diversion to the disappearance of the plane, then they succeeded with flying colors, because they managed to keep the attention and to some extent the hope of the families going on for years. At the beginning, you had the Prime Minister of Australia, Tony Abbott, when he visited China in April, I think. He went first to Hainan and then he went to Shanghai and Beijing. He dared to say that they were a few kilometers away from the black boxes. He completely made up that story. It's a lie. And even people in Australia were embarrassed because they didn't know how could he say something like that, because it was just not true. But we've had dozens, if not hundreds, of statements keeping hope alive. And that's what Australia has been incredibly good at doing.
And, speaking of hope and, the families that, that still, I assume struggle with closure of the investigation. Is there, do you think that there's hope for the families, roughly 7 years later, over 7 years later?
I can't promise hope. I do my best for the truth to be exposed sooner rather than later. What it will take for the absolute truth to come out is a few more courageous people to speak out, because some people, and more than a few, do know what happened to that plane. And we can hope that some of them are courageous enough to tell the truth. But I also know, because I've studied a few dozens of other crash investigations, and I mentioned some of them in the addendum of the book. What you notice is that crash investigations are often extremely complicated and muddy, because what is at stake is so big in terms of economic, in terms of sometimes diplomacy, strategy, and I've talked, including today actually, to quite a few people who do crash investigations, and they do admit that between what they find and what they understand, and then what they are allowed to write in a report, and then what they see that is repeated in the press, each time you lose a layer of truth, basically. And that's why also at one point in the book, I think it's at the conclusion of that chapter, I say that very sadly, the truth is almost every time the first casualty of a plane crash. And you do see that too many times. There is a case in Italy. I'm currently in Italy, and there is a famous case called Ustica, which happened in 1980, so more than 40 years ago. And they've had 3 consecutive investigations. Every time they conclude something slightly different, the families are convinced that it was actually a military blunder, but they still don't have the truth. And books have been written, all the clues are there. So now the families are actually kind of convinced that this is what happened, but it's not officially recognized. It is less difficult for them because they knew that the plane had crashed there. So what they are missing is the real reason. In the case of MH370, it's much worse because they don't have a shred of evidence. They don't have the bodies, obviously, and everyone knows how impossible it is to mourn and to turn the page of losing someone important if you can't even bury them or if you can't even be sure that they are actually dead. For many years, and it's still the case of some people, especially among the Chinese families, some people are still convinced that their loved ones are not dead because they don't have a proof. And when Australia wanted to build some kind of building memorial on nearby Perth, the Chinese families opposed and said, how dare you build a memorial there where we don't believe, because we don't know, that our loved ones have actually crashed in that ocean rather than who knows where.
And I guess my last question for you is if there's any lesson to take away from an investigation like this or from a story like this, if any lesson, what would it be, do you think?
The lesson for depends for whom, actually. If it's lesson for journalism or lesson for investigation or lesson for civil aviation.
Well, I guess I know it's a bit of a broad question, but I think maybe for the investigations themselves, because I'm thinking about one thing that comes to mind is the plane crash that happened months after the disappearance, MH17, if I'm correct. That one was, it was clear that it was it was clear that it was shot down and people knew what happened. And so, if there's anything, again, if there's any lessons on the investigation side, what do you think it would be for MH370?
For MH370. The investigators, I talked to former investigators, and actually some investigators were involved in MH370 and have also contacted me afterwards after reading the book. They all admit they're not happy with their work, in the sense that they still can't explain the loss of the plane. So I don't think they can take any good takeout from that experience, in the sense that it's extremely frustrating for them. And of course, to look good, or for the optics, they will say we must make absolutely sure that we will not ever lose a plane again. But they haven't lost that plane, or actually they have lost that plane, depending who you're talking to. This plane has been lost, and some people know exactly what happened to that plane. So how can I say, the lesson in that case, don't destroy a civil aviation plane. That's the lesson. But it has happened before, and it will probably happen again. Accidentally, in most cases, and very seldom, possibly also voluntarily. But sadly, I don't really see any lesson that can be, at least at this point of the situation and of the investigation. I don't see any lesson that can be learned from this major fiasco, basically.
Mm. And sorry, this will be my last question, but from the media side now, from the media perspective, how do we go forward with covering future investigations like this without it being this, fiasco almost of coverage, of 24-hour coverage?
I think we need to be slower. I think media need to slow down, and we need to doubt more and question more, and challenge a narrative that does not make sense. You can't use as an excuse the fact that it's too complicated to understand, and this has been used a lot in the case of MH370, because they came up with very sophisticated theories, and it's like, don't worry if you don't understand. That's only for scientists, or that's for, very smart people, because it's high math. And but I can tell you for sure, and I'm sorry, we should not accept that kind of explanation. The moment people tell you it's too complicated, you should have a little red warning going on. And like us, as journalists, we cannot accept too complicated. Sometime, at some point, you have to say, I'm sorry, I need to understand. If you can understand, I can understand. Maybe you explain slowly. But honestly, in this case, they use this as an excuse to try and lose us, to try and say, trust me, because I know better. I am an astrophysicist. I am a specialist of satellite communication, etc. And actually, when you dig a little bit deeper, you can understand this thing, and you can see that they still don't make sense. So, lesson for the media is really to question more and not to confuse incredible and not credible.
Well, Florence de Changy, I want to thank you for your time today. Thank you for your insight. Thank you for your book. I just read it as well. But I just want to thank you for your time. I hope our listeners enjoyed our conversation. But thank you so much. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you very much for your interest, and relaying the story and making more people aware of the fact that it's nonsensical is also very important. So you're helping me, and you're probably helping our path to the truth.
I hope so. I really hope so.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much.